A slight bit disorientated now, I decided to sit down and take in the scenery for a spell. It was while I sat, admiring an almost endless landscape of stonework, that I first caught sight of those pigtails, long and buoyant, tied with small ruddy-colored ribbons. It wasn't until they had bounced a bit closer that I noticed that they were attached to a small girl, flitting in and out from behind the tombstones, playing what appeared to be some kind of game involving counting and rhyming. Her face was somewhat sunken, yet blissfully cheerful, and her voice made an odd, cute, jingling sound whenever she giggled. She took absolutely no notice of me at first, playing her game all around me, oblivious to anything else until she ended up directly in front of where I was sitting. She stopped, placed her hands behind her back, and simply looked up at me with a little smile perked between her pale rosy cheeks. Neither of us said anything for some time. We just kind of held our own ground and looked at one another. Then, with little or no warning, I hiccuped. At that moment, the girl suddenly took a step back with a perplexed look on her face. "You're not dead," she observed somewhat indignantly. I gave myself a brief examination, just to be certain. "I do not appear to be at the moment," I replied. The little girl's smile returned. "You sound funny," she chortled. She was not far wrong in saying so. I have perhaps neglected to mention that the sound of my internal monologue differs somewhat from the actual sound of my speaking voice. Truth be told, when I talk out loud, I sound a bit more like a bullfrog with a severe speech impediment who, due to a history of delinquency, has smoked far too many cigarettes in his day. "Are you dead?" I asked in as clear a croak as I could possibly muster under the circumstances. "I am a quarter dead," she replied. My inquiry as to what she meant by that came so quickly as to almost overtake her statement before she had finished saying it. To my surprise, she struck a recital pose. It seemed as though she had been practicing the execution of this explanation for quite some time. "My name is Ghazi," she proclaimed. "I come from a long, proud line of dead people. Everyone in my family history, right down to my grandmother, is 100% full-blooded dead. My mother is half dead. That makes me a quarter dead." I foolishly asked her which part of her was dead. She then showed me. It was at that moment that I decided it would probably be best if I refrained from asking any further questions involving this topic. Instead, I decided to ask her about how she came to reside in this place. She explained to me how many years ago the dead could be found all over the country, laying about wherever they pleased. That was before the living showed up and began forcing the dead to an existence 6 feet under. "That is why I live here," she said, "so that I can be closer to my people." It seemed strange to me at first that the dead had accepted these conditions without any form of protest. Ghazi went on to explain how the dead tend to be rather passive folk and rarely complain about where fate leaves them. Come to think of it, I had noticed that the dead do tend to stay out of the media, with the exception of an occasional celebrity. Ghazi could tell by the expression of amazement on my face that my interest in her lifestyle had been piqued. As a gesture of charitable education, she offered to spend the day introducing me to some of her partially dead activities. Since I still didn't have the slightest clue as to how to get back to where I had come from, I decided to make a day of it. While I watched her play a most imaginative interpretation of tiddlywinks, I felt compelled to ask if the dead really didn't mind such hijinks going on around them. The small girl was authentically puzzled as to what I was trying to get at. "Do the dead really not care that you happen to be playing with parts of them in such a fashion?" I asked. "The dead do not care," she explained. "They cannot care. Such a state of being is strictly a living condition. The dead are just that. Dead. The dead do not know or care about any respect, ritual, or effort to please them in their state of rest. The tombstones, the eulogies, the memorials, these are things created only to comfort those still breathing, though many of them fail to realize this fact." Ghazi spent the remainder of the afternoon explaining to me how the living see the dead, like most foreign races, as a rather unnerving mystery. It is in part due to this tragic misunderstanding that the living tend to neglect their own kind until after they've shifted to the other side. She pointed out some of the larger stone monuments, and observed that the more extravagant the stonework, the more guilt the living probably felt about how little time they had spent with the body pre-mortem. It is not the most clever or deeply thinking mechanism that I house in my balding cranium. However, I began to slowly understand what she was telling me. And it was in thinking about this that I suddenly remembered the living companion that I had left sitting at home when I wandered off so absent-mindedly. I was once again concerned about finding my way home. I explained to the girl about how I had gotten lost, and how badly I needed to return to my domicile. To my surprise, she told me to wait where I was, and that she knew exactly what to do. Normally, I would think that the dead would not respond to a disturbance such as this. However, it is difficult to ignore such morbid cuteness. Before I knew it, word was traveling quickly through the underground channels about my predicament. As it turns out, several deceased hunting dogs had heard me thumping by from the south earlier that day, and a nameless body in the basement of a reclusive serial killer was fairly certain that I had veered that direction from the west when the bug I was chasing shifted its chosen destination slightly. My path of return was set, along with a few handy shortcuts to boot. With a great deal of gratitude in my heart, I walked Ghazi back to her mausoleum and promised that I would come visit again soon. I then made my way back home, where, upon arrival, I immediately received a most stern thrashing from Charo as punishment for my foolishness. I know she only does it because she cares about me, and I accept it. I have, since that day, made many trips back to the cemetery, and Ghazi is always pleased to see me return, doubly so when I bring Rice Krispie squares. Odd. It doesn't really feel all that different. Only calmer, perhaps.